What was farming really like in the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago? For centuries, we have imagined biblical agriculture as something rustic and simple, a life of patient farmers walking behind wooden plows under endless Middle Eastern sun. But what if that image misses the harshest truth? What if farming in first-century Judea was not about skill or hard work, but about accepting absolute dependency on forces no one could control? What if every planting season began not with confidence, but with silent anxiety, watching the sky and waiting for rain that might never come? What if the harvest was not a moment of celebration, but a moment of terror, when tax collectors arrived to take half of everything you had grown, leaving you to calculate whether what remained would keep your family alive until next year? And what if the difference between survival and disaster was so thin that one failed crop, one illness during planting season, or one excessive tax could trigger an irreversible collapse from independent farmer to landless laborer? When you step into the reality of ancient farming, you discover a world that operated at the absolute edge of viability, where every tool was optimized for constraints, every crop choice revealed your margin of survival, and every harvest could be your last as a free person. Stay until the end, because what you will discover goes far beyond agricultural history. It is the material foundation that shaped the words, the warnings, and the desperate hope of everyone who lived in that world. The first thing you need to understand about farming in the time of Jesus is that it did not begin with planting. It began with waiting. Waiting for rain that would determine whether your family ate or starved. Waiting for weather patterns you could not predict and could not control. During this period, the region experienced what modern researchers call the Roman climate optimum. The land we imagine as perpetually sun-scorched desert was actually far more temperate and lush. Significant rainfall came during the winter months, transforming the Judean highlands and the Galilee into fertile zones, where forests grew and valleys became oceans of wildflowers each spring. But the year was split into two absolute periods. From mid-October to mid-April, the wet season brought gray rains, biting winds, and cold that dropped toward freezing in the highlands. Then, from mid-June to mid-September, the dry season arrived with constant sun and no rain at all. Not a drop. For 6 straight months, nothing fell from the sky. This meant that every crop planted depended entirely on the timing and quantity of two specific rainfall events. The first was called the early rain. It came in late autumn, just as farmers prepared to plow and sow their fields. Without it, seeds would not germinate. The soil would remain too hard to work. The second was called the latter rain. It arrived in late winter and early spring, just as the grain was maturing. Without it, the crop would not fatten. The harvest would fail. Farmers had no control over either event. They could prepare their fields perfectly, choose the best seeds, work from dawn until exhaustion, and still lose everything if the rain did not come, or if it came too late, or if it came too hard and washed the topsoil away. Success was not a product of effort, it was a product of dependency. This created a permanent state of anxiety that governed the entire agricultural calendar. Farmers measured time by the behavior of the environment, the warmth of the soil, the arrival of specific winds, the way insects and birds moved. These were the signs that told you whether the rain was near or whether you were facing disaster. And so the work began not with confidence, but with silent vigilance, watching the sky, feeling the air, hoping that the forces beyond your control would align just enough to let you survive another year. Once the rain arrived and the soil softened, the plowing could begin. But the plow itself reveals something crucial about ancient farming. It was not designed to dig deep. It was designed to survive. The primary tool was a simple wooden plow, sometimes tipped with a small piece of iron. It was pulled by oxen or donkeys, guided by a farmer whose arms provided most of the force, and it barely scratched the surface. The plow penetrated only about 5 inches into the ground. To the modern eye, this looks primitive, inefficient, a sign of technological backwardness. But it was not. It was intentional. The soil of the Judean hills was thin and rocky. Plowing too deep would hit stone and break the tool. But more importantly, plowing too deep would expose too much soil surface to the air. And once the dry season arrived, that exposed earth would lose moisture rapidly. The sun would bake it, the wind would carry it away, the fields would turn to dust. Shallow plowing was a survival strategy. It kept the soil structure intact. It preserved what little moisture remained. It adapted to the reality of a 6-month dry season with no irrigation, no artificial watering, and no technological backup. The plow did not conquer the land. It worked within the land's limits. This was true of every tool in the ancient farmer's kit. None of these tools were primitive failures. They were refined solutions, tested over generations, optimized for durability and efficiency in a resource-constrained environment. The farmer did not lack ambition. He lacked alternatives, and so he adapted. Once the fields were plowed and the seeds planted, the next question was simple but brutal. What do you plant? And for most families, the answer was not a choice. It was a calculation of survival. Barley was the grain of the poor. It grew in worse soil than wheat. It required less rainfall. It resisted drought better. And most importantly, it matured a full month earlier. By April, barley was ready to harvest. By May, wheat was ready. That 1 month difference was the difference between life and death. Here is why. By April, most families had exhausted their stored grain from the previous year. The winter months had consumed their reserves. They were eating the last scraps, rationing portions, stretching everything as far as it would go. If they had to wait until May for the wheat harvest, many would not make it. They would starve before the new grain arrived. Barley was the lifeline. It refilled the storage jars in April, just before total depletion. It allowed families to survive long enough to see the wheat harvest. It was not better grain. Wheat had higher gluten content, made lighter bread, tasted better. But barley was earlier, and earlier meant alive. So poor families planted barley, wealthy families planted wheat. The grain you grew revealed not just your economic status, but your margin of survival. If you could afford to wait until May, you ate better bread. If you could not, you ate barley and stayed alive. And even after the harvest, the grain was not yet food. It had to be threshed to separate the kernels from the chaff. This happened on hard stone floors, where wooden boards studded with metal teeth were dragged over the grain by oxen, crushing the stalks and loosening the seeds. Only after all that could the grain be stored, and only after storage could it be processed. Growing the grain was only the beginning. Turning it into food required a kind of labor that consumed the body from the inside out. Every morning, before the family could eat, someone had to grind the grain. This was done by hand, using heavy basalt stones. One stone sat flat on the ground. The other was held in both hands and pushed back and forth across the grain, crushing the kernels into flour. The motion was repetitive, relentless, and physically exhausting. Why not grind a week's worth of flour at once and store it? Because flour spoiled. It absorbed moisture. Insects infested it. Grain could be stored for months or even years if kept dry. Flour could not, so every day the grinding had to be done again. For a woman feeding a family of 5, this was not a minor task. It was a significant portion of her daily labor. And here is the cruel mathematics. The act of grinding consumed a measurable portion of the calories the bread would provide. She was burning energy to produce the food that would give her energy. The margin was thin. This was true of nearly every stage of food processing. Pressing olives into oil required patience and repeated effort. Crushing grapes for wine required monitoring and timing. Nothing was automatic. Nothing was fast. Every meal represented hours of accumulated effort, distributed across days and weeks. This is what farming actually meant in the 1st century. It was not just planting and harvesting. It was an endless cycle of physical transformation. And every step cost energy, time, and endurance. The harvest should have been a moment of relief. But in 1st century Judea, the harvest was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new and more dangerous one, because that was when the tax collectors arrived. The Roman Empire extracted taxes from every corner of its territory. In Judea, this took 2 primary forms: a land tax, calculated based on the size and productivity of your fields, and a poll tax, levied on every individual. These were not optional. They were fixed obligations, due at harvest time, regardless of how much you had actually grown. But the Romans were not the only ones extracting. Local vassal kings, like the Herods, imposed their own levies to fund building projects and maintain armies. Between the 2 layers of taxation, it is estimated that at least half of the annual harvest was taken. Some years, more. Think about what that meant. You spent 6 months watching the sky, hoping for rain. You plowed, planted, weeded, and waited. You harvested, threshed, and stored. And then, at the moment when the grain was finally yours, representatives of the state arrived and took half of it. What remained had to sustain your family, your livestock, and your seed supply for the next planting season. It had to last an entire year. Now consider what happened in a bad year. The rain came late. A storm damaged the crop. The harvest was smaller than expected, but the tax quota did not change. It was fixed. The collectors did not care if your yield was poor. They cared that you paid what you owed. So, what did you do? You could hand over everything and starve, or you could take a loan, borrow grain or money from an urban lender at a high interest rate, pay the tax, and promise to repay the loan after next year's harvest. This was the trap, because if next year's harvest was also poor, you could not repay. The debt grew, interest compounded, and eventually the lender foreclosed. Your land was taken. You became a tenant farmer, working the same fields you once owned, but now keeping only a fraction of what you grew. This was the mechanism by which independent farmers were systematically reduced to poverty. The harvest was the moment of maximum vulnerability. It was when your wealth was visible, concentrated, and accessible. The harvest was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. Even if you survived the tax extraction, there was still one inescapable reality. You could not farm alone. The agricultural calendar had two critical windows that demanded total community participation. The first was the late autumn planting season. The second was the late spring harvest. These were the moments when individual capacity was insufficient and collective action became necessary. Once the early rains softened the soil, the window for sowing was narrow. Wait too long and the soil would dry out again. The seeds would not germinate. So every family in the village had to plow, sow, and prepare their fields within the same few weeks. But plowing required oxen. Not every family owned oxen. So oxen were shared, rotated between households, coordinated through social obligation and mutual dependency. The same was true of the harvest. Grain had to be cut at the right moment. Too early, and the kernels would be underdeveloped. Too late, and they would shatter and fall to the ground. Once cut, the grain had to be threshed immediately. This required threshing floors, draft animals, and many hands working together. A single family could not manage it. And then there was the ongoing work of weeding. The only fertilizer available was animal manure. But manure carried weed seeds, so every time you fertilized your field, you reintroduced weeds. And the only way to remove them was by hand. Hours and hours of manual labor, pulling out unwanted plants one by one. This is why the agricultural calendar structured the entire social system. You needed your neighbors, they needed you. Reciprocity was not a moral ideal, it was a survival mechanism. If you refused to help during someone else's planting season, they would refuse to help during yours. And if they refused, you failed. After the harvest was gathered, after the taxes were paid, the grain finally came home. It was stored in large ceramic jars, partially buried in the floor to keep the temperature stable. These jars held everything: the family's food supply, the seed for next year's planting, the buffer between survival and starvation. But storage was not security. It was maintenance. The jars had to be checked constantly for cracks. Pests had to be monitored. Humidity had to be managed. A single mistake could ruin months of grain. And even under perfect conditions, most families stored only enough to last until the next harvest. Not 2 years, not 3. 1 year, that was the margin. Wealthier families had deeper reserves. They could store grain for 2 or 3 years. They had better jars, thicker walls, more secure storage spaces. This meant that when a bad year came, they survived. They could wait it out. They could even lend grain to poorer neighbors at interest, turning crisis into profit. Poor families had none of this. Their jars were thinner, more prone to cracking. Their reserves were minimal. A single failed harvest pushed them over the edge. And once they fell, they rarely climbed back. The large ceramic jars buried in the floor were not just storage containers. They were the physical representation of survival itself. What was inside them determined whether the family would eat, whether they could plant next year, whether they would remain independent or slide into debt and dependency. To understand farming in the time of Jesus is to understand that it operated at the absolute edge of viability. There was no room for error. One missed rain meant a compromised harvest. One illness during planting season meant delayed sowing and reduced yield. One excessive tax demand meant forced loans and the beginning of a debt spiral that ended in foreclosure and landlessness. The system worked, but only barely. It sustained life, but it did not provide security. Every year was a test. Every harvest was a gamble. And the stakes were not just economic, they were biological. If the grain ran out before the next harvest, people starved. If the tax collector took too much, people starved. If storage failed, people starved. This is why ancient farmers developed such precise, optimized techniques. The shallow plow was not ignorance. It was adaptation to thin, rocky soil and the need to preserve moisture. The choice of barley over wheat was not preference. It was a calculated decision to harvest a month earlier and avoid starvation. The communal labor during planting and harvest was not tradition. It was necessity. Every tool, every crop choice, every social arrangement was a response to constraint. And the overarching constraint was this: farming in first-century Judea depended entirely on forces beyond human control, while simultaneously being subjected to extraction by forces with total human control. The rain was unpredictable, the tax was certain, the harvest was variable, the quota was fixed. And in that gap between what nature provided and what the state demanded, families either survived or collapsed. Understanding this reality changes how we read ancient texts. When the sources speak of harvest, they are not describing abundance. They are describing a moment of vulnerability. When they speak of debt, they are not describing carelessness. They are describing the inevitable result of a system designed to extract maximum value from farmers, operating at minimum capacity. When they speak of daily bread, they are not using metaphor. They are describing the literal, immediate, desperate need for food that might not be there tomorrow. First-century farming was not romantic. It was not simple. It was a constant, exhausting, high-stakes struggle to extract survival from a world that offered no guarantees. And the people who lived through it knew, in their bodies and in by their bones, that they were always one disaster away from losing everything. By observing how farming actually worked in the time of Jesus, we discover that it was not a peaceful life of simple toil under endless sun. It was a precarious balance between dependency and extraction, between manual labor and biological limits, between survival and collapse. Ancient farmers did not lack skill or determination. They lacked control. They lived within a system where success depended on rain they could not summon, while failure was guaranteed by taxes they could not escape. Understanding this world illuminates the ancient texts and reveals a reality where every reference to harvest, debt, and daily bread carried the weight of genuine desperation. And if this documentary strengthened your understanding and expanded your historical perspective, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Your support allows more people to discover the material reality that shaped the ancient world. Until the next video.